In analyzing a pitcher's quality, we look at the pitcher's movement profile. That's how much it's moving vertically and horizontally. We'll also look at the velocity of the pitch and whether any of those components are kind of deceptive based on the pitcher's release or arm slot. But for a changeup, unlike almost any other pitch in baseball, to get the clearest picture of its quality, we have to dig into the changeup in relation to the pitcher's primary fastball. So in this video, I'm going to dig into a quick rule that I kind of use to kind of predict almost whether I expect a changeup to be good. And I'm also going to dig into one outlier that kind of bucks the trend, that kind of shows us how much we still have to discover around this topic. There are two important parameters to consider when looking at a pitcher's changeup in relation to his fastball. The first has to do with the velocity difference between the two pitches. How much slower is a pitcher's changeup than his fastball? And the second has to do with the difference in vertical movement. How much more is a pitcher's changeup dropping than his fastball? And when you look at all changeups in baseball historically on these parameters, you kind of bucket them off, so to speak, and look at different bins and almost see some similarities and differences and start to understand that there are specific bins, specific kinds of velocity differences and movement differences that result in better changeups or have resulted in better changeups in the past, and others that a pitcher probably shouldn't throw too much. So a huge shout out to Driveline Baseball's Chris Langin for this tweet that kind of helped me understand this topic, because I would definitely not be able to do it any better than he has, and I'm very much stealing it. In general, there's a particular kind of changeup that is performed historically average to bad. And it's not really surprising, but it's one that's firm and doesn't have a ton of drop. The bin for this changeup is one that's separated in comparison to a pitcher's primary fastball by less than 7 miles per hour. And it's separated in comparison to a pitcher's primary fastball by less than 10 inches of vertical movement. I kind of think of this personally as the 7 and 10 rule. Once a changeup breaks either of those parameters, you start to get into good changeup territory. So if a pitcher starts separating his changeup by more than 7 miles per hour or more than 10 inches of vertical movement, you start to get a quality changeup. And that leads us to a particular bucket of changeups that have historically performed very well in baseball. And it almost has to do entirely with the vertical movement component as opposed to the velocity component. So regardless of what the velocity difference is between your changeup and your fastball, if you're able to separate your changeup by more than 10 inches of vertical movement in relation to your fastball, you're in really good shape. And I think this kind of runs counter to something I always believed and saw and have heard, which is a focus on that velocity bucket rather than the vertical movement bucket. And I think the reason for this is that velocity is ever present. Whenever you're watching a broadcast, you're always going to see velocity pop up, which is a very easy shorthand way for anybody to kind of think they understand whether that changeup is going to be a quality changeup. When if you look at Chris Langin's buckets here, historically, that doesn't matter as much. If you're separating that pitch and creating the ability to kill spin, you're going to end up in a better scenario. And I think it's not focused on the vertical movement bucket because that concept's a little bit harder to explain, but I'm going to try to give it a quick shot. It just has to do with killing spin, right? As we talk about in a ton of my videos in the past, if you have a good backspun fastball, you have the ability to create spin and resist the force of gravity pushing the ball downwards, such that you almost get a little bit of that rise effect, carry or ride as it's often called. But if you kill spin, if you use weaker fingers to actually spin the ball, what it does is it creates less of a force against gravity, which allows gravity to act on the ball and push that ball downward more, creating a greater vertical movement separation. That's the key component, according to Chris Langin's chart here, to changeups. So how does this check out with some of the best and worst changeups last year? Pretty good. For example, Blake Snell had one of the 10 worst performing changeups in baseball last year, and he separated his changeup by only 7 miles per hour velocity and 8 inches of drop, bumping up against the 7 and 10 rule, but not enough to break it. The inverse holds up pretty well too. Zach Greinke's changeup doesn't have a ton of speed differential compared to his fastball, but he's able to generate an extra 12 inches of drop in relation to his fastball. Brandon Woodruff is another really good example here who has a great changeup. The pitch separates itself to his fastball by over 10 miles per hour, and it drops more than 10 inches. Now, are these buckets absolutes? Absolutely not. The point here is to give us a more mature understanding rather than making something that is perfectly accurate. There are numerous other factors that matter for changeups. For example, command, deception, and potentially arm speed, which is brought up a ton when talking to players about what makes a good changeup. The problem is that with the public information that we have, there isn't really a good way to quantify things like arm speed, deception, or even command for that matter, which limits our ability to objectively look at changeups beyond measurables like velocity and movement differences. To close this out, I want to talk about a changeup outlier, and it's Patrick Sandoval. The only problem is just that he does break our 7 and 10 rule. On the vertical movement separation side of things, he doesn't. His changeup only separated from his fastball by about 5 inches of vertical movement, but on the velocity side of things, he does, ever so slightly. Our rule is to get over about 7 miles per hour of difference between a changeup and a fastball. He's just over that at about 8 miles per hour of velocity separation. But as we know earlier, the vertical movement bucket is a little bit more important here. That results in the elite changeup regardless of the velocity side of things. And Patrick Sandoval very much has an elite changeup. He had an incredible whiff rate on the pitch last year. It is objectively one of the best changeups in baseball based on last year's data. And you would not expect that based on what we're looking at from the velocity bucket and the vertical movement separation buckets. Those two parameters do not suggest that this pitch historically is as good as it is. So what's happening? I think it could be a command thing. He could be commanding the ball incredibly well. It could also be an arm speed thing. And this is what I said earlier. When you talk to players, I think that's the key thing you're always going to get is you have to mimic arm speed. You have to make it look like the pitch. But again, we don't really have the tracking the information to back in and objectively validate that point. So I think it's coming, at least now, the leader in my mind, so to speak, is that it's coming from the orientation of the pitch. See, Patrick Sandoval throws a 4-seam oriented changeup. So if you think of a normal 4-seam fastball where you're covering the 2 seams right there, he's just going right over to the side with weaker fingers and throwing his changeup this way and turning the pitch over. Whereas most changeups you're going to see are on the track. So if you think of your sinkers and 2-seam fastballs, which are thrown there, then you go over to your 2 fingers there, or potentially a little bit more up on the ball in a sinker orientation on that changeup. So what's happening with that seam orientation? I'm not 100% sure, but my theory is that it has something to do with the spin of the ball. Because if you're throwing a 4-seam fastball like this and that ball is rotating, and then all you're doing is just jumping over here and creating the exact same movement, just with weaker fingers, which creates less backspin and therefore less resistance to gravity, which pulls that pitch down and allows it to have more vertical movement. Maybe that is throwing off hitters from a perception standpoint, which I think is a key thing that is always a component when I talk to coaches. They're always like, you have to get hitter feedback when you're in the box on pitches. And this doesn't show up really on the data side of things. And I think a lot of the times it could be an explainer. So that's my guess right now as to why Patrick Sandoval's changeup is so good. And again, I think it highlights, we have these buckets and we have a general parameter as to what we think makes good changeups, but all the time there's outliers out there. So I hope this video gave you a pretty good understanding of how to look at a changeup pretty objectively, pretty quick with that 7 and 10 rule to understand whether you expect historically that pitch to be good. But I hope it also kind of gave you an idea to not take that 7 and 10 rule and make it gospel, make it the main thing that you look at. There's always room for outliers. There's always room for things like deception and other things to come into play on Patrick Sandoval and other guys like an Ian Anderson. And hitter feedback is incredibly important. So keep an eye on this the next game you watch.